The stagecoach stopped at noon, when there was no shadow left to fall. The ground was cracked. The red dust clung to her skirt, her neck, even the trembling fingers of Etta May. She stood still for a moment on the wooden step, her eyes tracing the town road stretched out like a scorched mark beneath the Texas sun. Inside the small suitcase clutched in her arms were only 3 worn dresses, a faded photograph of her mother, and a frayed-edged Bible. People stopped to stare. A boy sucking on a candy stick gaped at her. A man spat tobacco onto the ground and glanced at her over his shoulder. A few women whispered behind the curtain of the dress shop. Etta knew that feeling well, the stare of a place that didn't want her to stay, only curious to see how long she could endure it. From the far end of the street, a man appeared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat casting half his face in shadow. His sleeves were rolled up, his back dust-stained. A length of dark leather coiled at his hip. He walked slowly, each step weighted like a man long used to carrying life's burdens. When he drew close, the sunlight caught his face, revealing a thin scar along his temple, old but sharp as a memory that refused to fade. Etta felt her heartbeat quicken. The rumors from Missouri came rushing back. Cole Hartwell, the man who'd killed in Copper Bend. A woman had fled his home one night. Another had gone missing, never found. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck, yet her feet wouldn't move when he stopped before her. He didn't speak for several seconds. He simply looked at her the way a man might study a wild horse driven to the fence. Not threatening, but not yielding either. Then one corner of his mouth tilted in the faintest hint of a smile. His voice was rough, low, slow as smoke rising from a stove. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't bite, unless you ask." No one laughed. Even the wind seemed to pause. Etta froze, her chest tightening more from surprise than fear. Heat flooded her cheeks. She couldn't tell if it was from the sun or from the audacity of words that broke every rule of courtesy she'd ever known. She stepped back, clutching her suitcase, breath catching in her throat. He bowed his head at once, voice dropping, remorse clear. "Sorry. Poor joke. Name's Cole Hartwell. You must be Miss Carter." She didn't answer. The sun hit her eyes, turning everything to blur. When he bent to pick up the suitcase she'd dropped, his rough fingers brushed hers, just for an instant, but long enough for something sharp to stir inside her. Not fear, something softer, stranger, that made her forget to pull away. He straightened, and under the brim of his hat, his silver-gray eyes caught the light. Not fierce, as she'd expected, but weary, the kind of light found in someone who's seen too much loss. "My place is west of the ridge," he said quietly. "Dusty road, but peaceful." Etta nodded, her voice too small to carry. They walked side by side, 3 steps apart. The wind pulled up ribbons of golden dust around their boots, and the old horse behind the coach let out a tired whinny. As they passed the edge of town, Etta looked back once. The onlookers had dispersed. Ahead lay only the long, blinding road, and the broad back of the man walking before her, his figure blending with the sunlight, every step steady, shaped by endurance. She didn't know why she kept pace with him, or why she didn't run like she always had. Maybe it was the way he said sorry. Nothing like the men who'd made her afraid. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, someone had called her ma'am, as if she was still someone worth respect. And so, beneath the burning Texas noon, the woman who had spent her life running walked beside the man everyone else swore to avoid. Neither of them knew that the half-mile they shared that day would become the beginning of everything they once believed impossible. The road to the ranch stretched between sunburned fields. Etta followed behind Cole, taking careful, measured steps, her hand clutching the suitcase he carried for her. The dry wind swept across the plain, lifting the dust that gilded her worn leather shoes. In the distance, a house emerged, small, old, but standing firm in the scorched land. A barn leaned to one side, fences slanted like tired bones, and a single cottonwood bent eastward, broken once by storms but still alive. Cole stopped at the porch, set her suitcase down, and took off his hat. He wiped the sweat from his brow before saying quietly, "Not much, but it's quiet. You can stay here if you like. If not, I'll take you back to town come morning." His tone held no demand, no plea, only calm certainty, as if speaking to someone who had a choice, not a thing to be bought. Etta glanced past him into the house. The light of late afternoon filtered through bare windows, laying pale bars of gold across the gray-brown floor. She took a slow breath. I just need somewhere to sleep," she murmured. Cole nodded. He stepped inside first, placing her suitcase near the wall across from the small iron stove. The air smelled faintly of old soap and wood ash. He gestured toward a narrow door at the end of the hall. "That room locks from the inside," he said in a low, steady voice. "Stay or leave. It's up to you." The key rested in his palm, small and bronze, edges worn bright by years of use. He held it out, and after a pause, she reached for it. When the metal brushed her skin, warmth lingered from his hand, a fleeting thing, but enough to make her heartbeat stumble. He gave a small nod, then turned and stepped out without looking back. The door closed softly, leaving a silence that stretched wide as the plains. Etta stood in the kitchen, listening to the wind thread through the cracks in the wood. The house was bare. Rough-hewn table, a few chairs, a water jug, a blackened stove. On the wall hung an old leather hat and a neatly coiled whip. Everything was orderly, the kind of neatness that comes from living alone too long. As dusk fell, she retreated to the small room. The bed was narrow, the blanket thin. She didn't change or remove her shoes. Sitting against the wall, she held the ink bottle in her hand, the one thing she'd carried from every place she'd fled. It had become a strange kind of weapon, something to throw if anyone tried the door. Outside, the wind scraped the roof. Each creak of the floorboards tightened her chest. She wasn't used to silence. Where she came from, night was never kind. Then footsteps, slow, steady, drawing closer, stopping at her door. Her grip on the ink bottle hardened, her breath stilled. The lock turned softly. The door opened a narrow slit, just enough for a warm light to spill through. Cole stood in the doorway, framed by the glow of a kerosene lamp, the faintest caution in his gaze. He held a folded blanket and a basin, steaming tin cup. "I forgot," he said quietly, voice low and rough. "Nights get colder here than you think." He set the blanket on the floor beside the cup, never stepping farther in. "Water's warm," he added. Then he straightened and closed the door behind him. Silence returned, gentle this time. Only the faint warmth of the hallway light lingered through the crack beneath the door. Etta stayed still for a long while. The ink bottle remained in her hand, but her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from something else. Something she had never known. The feeling of being left alone, unharmed, safe. She placed the bottle down and reached for the blanket. The fabric was coarse, carrying a scent of old wool and smoke. As she wrapped it around her shoulders, the warmth spread slowly, as if it came from his hands rather than the cloth itself. Her tears fell quietly, no sobbing, just small, measured drops soaking into the wool, into her skin, into that unfamiliar peace she didn't dare name. Outside, the wind brushed the window pane. The hallway light glowed faint and steady, soft as breath. For the first time in years, Etta felt safe inside a house with a lock, and a man who didn't need to open it for her to believe she was safe. Morning in Copper Bend arrived with a silence Etta had never known. No train whistles, no shouts from the street. Only the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves and the faint clink of chains from the horse stall behind the house. The first light slid through the bare window frame, painting the wooden floor in a narrow stream of gold. Etta woke in the unfamiliar room she'd barely dared to sleep in. The wool blanket Cole had brought her still rested over her shoulders, its warmth now just a memory. She heard footsteps in the kitchen, unhurried, steady, like the rhythm of a man long used to solitude. When she stepped out, Cole was sitting at the table, a tin cup of coffee in hand, his hair damp with morning mist. He said nothing, just tipped his head toward another cup across from him, steam curling above it. Etta hesitated before walking forward. They sat facing each other. No greetings, no questions. Only the soft tap of a spoon against metal. The smell of dark coffee filled the air, bitter but grounding. When she took a sip, the warmth spread down her throat, chasing away the last fragments of night. She couldn't remember the last time she'd shared a morning drink with someone since her mother died. When she set her cup down, Cole rose and opened the back door. "There's something you ought to see," he said, and stepped outside. Etta followed after a pause. Behind the house lay a small patch of land, a low fence of gray wood, and near the stable, a narrow row of flowers pushing through the cracked red soil. Their petals were white, fragile, and stubborn against the dust. Etta stopped short, her breath caught. "White chrysanthemums," she whispered. "My mother used to grow these." Cole tilted his head, then crouched to pull a weed from between them. "So did mine," he said, his voice roughened by wind and years. "She once told me, if you plant what once made you happy, maybe happiness will find its way back." Etta looked at him. The sunlight cut across his face, dividing it into light and shadow. The words were quiet, but they settled deep, like a promise she hadn't asked for but somehow needed. She knelt and brushed her fingertips across a blossom. It was soft, delicate, trembling slightly in the wind. Her throat ached. When she was little, her mother used to say, "These flowers don't fear summer or storms. They only fear being forgotten." Cole stepped closer. His hand smelled faintly of soil and pine sap. He didn't touch her, yet the air between them grew smaller, filled with the steady sound of his breathing. For the first time in years, Etta felt she was standing inside a space that was safe. "You could plant more," he said softly. "Soil's dry but deep, holds water well." She shook her head. "I don't know how to grow things." "You'll learn," he said. "Everything can be learned, if you stay." She looked up. Their eyes met for the first time without retreat. No words, only the light slanting through the thin curtain behind him, striking his sunburned cheek. His gaze wasn't probing, nor pitying, just still. as if he was memorizing the sight of someone he didn't want to harm. In that quiet, something within her shifted. A nameless peace. Not love, not gratitude. Just the feeling of breathing without fear. She looked again at the row of white flowers. Their petals quivered, fragile yet persistent. Like her, like him. That evening, as the sun leaned westward, she carried a small wooden pail into the yard. Her hands, clumsy and untrained, turned the earth. Dirt clung to her fingers and sleeves. Cole stayed a few yards away, saying nothing, leaving beside her a bucket of rainwater and a spade. When she looked up, he was already walking back toward the stable, his figure melting into the golden dusk. In the middle of that dry patch of earth, Etta knelt and pressed another seedling into the ground. For the first time, she was planting something not to survive, but to believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness could still find its way home. That afternoon, the heat over Copper Bend felt like it could melt bone. The wind carried the scorched smell of dry grass and the distant rhythm of hooves from the southern ridge. Etta was hanging laundry on the porch when she saw Cole's brown horse charging toward the house, dust swirling thick behind it. When he dismounted, she saw the dark stain spreading across his shoulder, blood soaking through the faded fabric of his shirt. "You're hurt," she blurted. Cole drew in a sharp breath, meaning to say "I'm fine," but his knee buckled slightly. He caught himself against the saddle, sweat dripping down his neck in slow rivulets. Before he could answer, Etta was already beside him, slipping her hand under his arm. "Inside," she said, voice trembling. "Let me help." He didn't argue. Maybe he was too tired to. They crossed into the kitchen, heat still clinging to their skin from the relentless sun. Cole sank into a wooden chair, breathing heavy. Etta filled a metal basin with water, her hands shaking enough to spill some onto the floor. She reached for his coat, hesitating when her fingers brushed the blood on his sleeve. "Let me," she whispered. He nodded, lifting his arm carefully, hiding the wince that passed through his face. The fabric peeled away from the wound with a wet sound. Etta caught the quick tightening of his jaw as air hit the raw cut, long, deep, but not deadly. Beneath the torn skin, his back was dark from years of sun, muscle taut. But running down its center was an older mark, a long, rope-like scar, pale and unhealed even after time. She froze. Her eyes lingered on it longer than she meant to. Cole noticed and said quietly, voice gravelly, pulled from a place buried deep beneath the dust. "That one wasn't from a horse." Etta waited. "I used to scout," he said. "Union Army. Late '63, they sent me with a small patrol, 4 soldiers, 2 civilians. We found some folks hiding in a church near Franklin. Women, children." His gaze drifted out the window where sunlight pooled across the ground. "Orders came down to burn it. I said no." Etta's throat tightened. "They tied me up, whipped me till I passed out, left me in the grass when the fire spread." He shrugged lightly, as if it no longer mattered. "I lived, but my back, well, it stayed with me. I never killed anyone, Etta, but that didn't stop people from saying I did." The kitchen went silent. Even the chickens outside sounded far away, their clucking a faint echo from another world. Etta sat down beside him, wet cloth in hand, and began cleaning the fresh wound. Her fingers trembled as they met his skin. He didn't flinch, didn't look. As she leaned closer, the scent of soap and sweat mingled with the dry air. She could hear the low rhythm of his breath against her hair, short, rough, but restrained. "You could have told them," she said softly, eyes fixed on the streak of red that faded under her touch. "People believe what they want," he murmured. "I got tired of proving what I wasn't." She didn't answer. Each stroke of the cloth felt like stitching silence into the space between them. When the bleeding slowed, she reached for a needle and thread, its tip flashing in the light. "I'll sew it up," she said, her voice steady now. Cole gave a faint, weary smile. "You know how?" "I've sewn clothes for the dead," she said, without looking up. "Living flesh is easier." He gave a quiet laugh, one breath long, then gone. When the needle pierced his skin, he jerked once, then went still. She worked carefully, each stitch neat and measured, as if mending something far deeper than flesh. When she tied the final knot, Etta laid her hand gently on his shoulder. "Done," she whispered. Her palm was warm, trembling, but sure. Cole didn't turn. He only looked down at that small hand resting against him, saying nothing. Yet in the slant of sunlight through the window, something shifted between them. A fragile trust, unspoken but real, born not of words, but of touch. Before she left, Etta said softly, almost to herself, "Some things don't heal unless someone stays." He turned then, their faces close enough for breath to mingle. Cole didn't speak. He simply nodded, slow, certain, as if he understood that from that moment on, their pain had found shape, and perhaps someone willing to stitch it back together. That morning the wind swept early through Copper Bend. Clouds drifted low, carrying the scent of dry earth and the faint breath of river water. Etta wrapped a brown shawl around her shoulders and picked up the basket to head into town. Cole was tightening the cinch on his saddle, preparing to ride north to check the fences. "If you need anything," he said, "get coarse salt, the big grain kind." She nodded, not meeting his eyes. As she started down the road, his voice followed, quiet but firm. "Take it slow. Wind's strong today." The town sat half an hour's ride away. Weathered wooden houses leaned under years of dust. Torn posters fluttered on the walls. The smell of smoke and horses hung in the air. Etta kept her head down, pretending not to hear the murmurs that always rose when she passed. A black woman walking alone. Inside the general store, she filled her basket with beans, salt, and flour. Everything was ordinary until she heard the slow scrape of boots behind her. Then came the voice, slick, lazy, drenched in liquor, a voice she thought she'd left behind in the fire. "Well now," the man drawled, "if it ain't little Etta Mae Carter." Her body went cold. She turned, blood surging to her face. The man was lean, his skin leathered by sun, his narrow eyes half hidden beneath a hat brim. A ragged scar twisted across his lip each time he smiled. The reek of whiskey clung to him like rot. Etta's hand tightened on the basket handle until her knuckles blanched. He stepped closer, voice dropping to a syrupy whisper. "You can run west, girl," he murmured, breath foul against her skin. "But you can't wash away smoke. Still smell it on you. Smoke and sin." The world went soundless. Only her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Her hand shook. The basket slipped, beans scattering across the wooden floor. She stumbled back, then turned and ran. The bell over the door screamed as she burst through it. Dust kicked up under her shoes as she crossed the main street, skirts flying. breath breaking apart in her chest. No one called after her, but fear did. It chased her, hard and fast, until the only thing ahead was the gate to Cole's ranch. She shoved the door open and slid the bolt shut behind her. The smell of wood smoke and worn pine filled her lungs, but it couldn't steady her. The old fire rose in her mind again, the crackle of burning walls, her mother's voice calling through the smoke. Etta pressed herself into the corner, arms over her head, shaking as tears slipped soundlessly down her cheeks. By dusk, Cole rode in. His horse was lathered, dust streaking his shirt and arms. The mare tied outside was hers, rope twisted, saddle half loose. Something was wrong. He climbed the steps to the porch and knocked gently. "Etta?" Silence. Thick and heavy. He tried the handle, locked from inside. He stood there a moment, listening, then exhaled and stepped back. No pounding, no questions, just quiet, thought. In the kitchen, he lit the fire, the clink of a ladle against the pot breaking the stillness. He poured soup into a wooden bowl, tore a piece of bread, and placed them neatly on a tray, as carefully as if handling something fragile. When night fell, he carried it to her door and set it down. He didn't knock. Then he sat on the porch, back against the wall, rifle resting across his knees. His fingers tapped slow rhythms on the stock. His eyes never left the door, not waiting for it to open, only listening. Inside, Etta sat on the floor, head buried in her arms. She heard the faint creak of boards when he settled outside her room. For a moment she thought he'd call out, but he didn't. The silence between them held steady, gentle. Through the crack beneath the door, the lamplight glowed soft and golden. His shadow stretched long against the wall, still unmoving. Every so often, when the wind threatened to snuff the flame, he lifted his hand to shield it. Etta held her breath. Something warm began to rise in the space where fear used to live. Not comfort, not words, just presence. A man outside her door, all night, not crossing the line, not leaving. By dawn, the wind had stilled. She opened the door a fraction. The soup still sat there, faintly warm. Cole was slumped against the wall, head bowed, hand resting on his rifle, half asleep. Etta stood for a long while watching him. The old terror was still there, but it had shifted, softened, made room for something else. A quiet safety. She didn't know when her heartbeat had begun to match the rhythm of the man's breathing outside her door. Only that, for the first time in years, she was no longer afraid. And maybe that was how love began. Wordless, waiting, and born in the silence between two broken hearts. The night wind in Copper Bend usually carried the scent of damp soil and the hum of crickets. But that night was different, still, suspended, as if the whole land were holding its breath. The house lay under a pale wash of new moon light, silvering the porch in quiet. Etta sat inside her room, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. Through the crack beneath the door, she could see the faint glow of the lantern he always left burning outside, his unspoken way of saying, "I'm here." For nights now he had waited there, never knocking, never asking. Only the quiet patience of someone who understood how fear loosens not by force but by time. And in that silence, something inside her had shifted. Fear had hollowed out a space large enough for something else to enter. She rose. Bare feet touched the cold wooden floor. Her hand rested on the latch. One slow breath, then the soft click of release. The door opened. Cole looked up, as if he'd been waiting for that sound all his life. He sat on the porch, sleeves rolled, hat beside him, his rifle resting loosely across his knees. The moonlight caught the faint scar at his temple, the lines of fatigue around his eyes. But his face was calm, worn, yes, but at peace. Etta didn't speak. She stepped out and sat beside him on the porch steps. The wood was cold against her palms. The wind tugged at a strand of her hair. Cole glanced at her once, nodded slightly, and said nothing. They sat like that for a long while. No words, no touch, just listening to the quiet breathing of the night. After a time, the wind picked up, rattling the eaves. She pulled her shawl tighter, but it did little. When the gust rose again, her hand moved, almost without thought, and brushed the back of his. It was clumsy, trembling, almost accidental, but it stopped his breath. Cole didn't turn or pull away. He only reached for his coat, lifted it from the rail, and draped it gently over her shoulders. The fabric was coarse, carrying the scent of smoke and saddle leather, heavy but somehow soothing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the wind. He murmured back, "Colder than usual tonight." They fell quiet again, yet something was moving between them, not in words but in the small stillnesses between breaths. Etta looked out toward the dark field stretching endless before them. Her voice came softly, almost as if to herself. "I'm tired of running." Cole turned his head. The moon caught her eyes, bright, worn, honest. He studied her as though making sure she wasn't just talking about the road, but about the years she'd spent outrunning ghosts. Slowly, he lifted a hand, stopping midway between them. She didn't flinch. His palm found her cheek, rough, warm, gentle in a way she hadn't known a hand could be. His eyes were both afraid and hopeful, as though he feared breaking what was fragile, yet couldn't hold back any longer. Etta leaned into his touch, her cheek pressing against the calloused skin. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered. Cole swallowed hard, his voice breaking low. "Then just stay still a while." She smiled, a small, tired curve fading into moonlight. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to hush. Then he leaned forward. The first kiss wasn't rushed. It didn't burn. It was slow, deliberate. The kind of touch born from two people relearning what gentleness feels like. The wind swept under the porch, carrying away the sound of their breath, mingled and uneven. Her hand rested against his chest, feeling the steady, heavy pulse beneath. His arm wrapped around her, not tight, just enough. Everything else, wind, moon, darkness, melted away until only warmth remained. When he drew her closer, she didn't resist. The wall behind them held their shared heat, the faint scent of hay threading through their breath. That night, there were no promises, no names for what they had found. Only two souls once abandoned by the world, now discovering each other in silence. They didn't come together like the hungry or the lost, but like those who pray, not for salvation, but for peace. Slow, careful, afraid and trusting all at once. When the air finally stilled, Etta lay against his shoulder, eyes half closed. The walls within her, the ones built from fire, smoke, and grief, had at last come down. Outside, the moon hung pale, and the wind fell quiet. In the small house at the edge of Copper Bend, neither spoke a word. but both knew that night they had stopped running. They had. Days passed after that night, and Copper Bend softened into autumn. The air carried wood smoke and the faint scent of dried flowers. Life inside the small house settled into a quiet rhythm, steady, peaceful, almost like happiness, though neither of them dared call it that. Etta woke earlier than the sun. She lit the stove, brewed coffee, and set 2 cups on the table. Soon, Cole would come in from tending the horses, the cold still clinging to his hair. He always took his cup in silence. They didn't need words. The warmth of the coffee between them said enough. It said, "We're still here." But that morning was different. Etta brought her old leather journal to the chair by the window, the one she'd written in since arriving at Copper Bend. Its pages were yellowed, the ink dark, her handwriting slanted and uneven. She wrote to make sense of her life, to give order to the noise inside her mind. The last line she'd written the night before, after he'd fallen asleep beside the dim lamp, had come without thought. "I married him to survive, not to love." It had slipped out like a breath she'd been holding for years. The truth of a woman who once fled from ashes, who hadn't yet learned what it meant to stay. This morning, she left the journal on the chair near the hearth. When Cole came in after feeding the horses, he dropped his hat on the hook and reached for his usual seat. The smell of coffee filled the air. His hand brushed against the journal lying open, a single page folded slightly by the breeze. He meant only to close it, but his eyes caught the words before he could turn away. "I married him to survive, not to love." The letters were small, neat, painfully honest. He stared at them for a long moment, the world narrowing to that one sentence. His coffee cooled untouched. Then, quietly, he closed the book, placed it back exactly where it had been, and left the room. When Etta returned, he was already outside, tightening the saddle. The rising sun painted his shoulders in pale gold. She smiled faintly, ready to greet him, but he didn't turn. "I'll be at the West Field," he said evenly. "Don't wait for lunch." His tone was calm, polite, but the distance between his words was new. That evening, he came home late. There were no fresh chrysanthemums by the fence, no coffee waiting on the table. The house felt emptier than it had in months. Etta sat at the kitchen table, staring at the chair opposite hers, the one he never used to leave unfilled. The next day, he spoke little. When he did, his eyes slid past her, never resting long enough to meet. The mornings were quiet, too quiet. No sound of spoon against cup, no shared warmth across the table. At night, she heard his footsteps pacing outside the porch, slow, uncertain, fading into the dark. At first, she told herself he was just tired, but later, when she noticed her journal slightly shifted, one page bent and the ink faintly smudged near the wall corner, she knew. She sat there for a long time, fingers resting on the line that had betrayed her. The ink was dry, but the words still cut like they were new. Not to love. She hadn't meant it for him, hadn't even meant it for now, but that didn't matter. It was still a wound, one she had given with her own hand. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house creaked and breathed around her, the way old houses do when they remember too much. She thought of every small thing he'd ever done. The blanket left at her door, the bowl of soup, the flowers, the steady hand on her cheek when she trembled, and she understood. Love didn't begin when two people touched. It began when one of them left and took all the warmth with them. Etta sat by the window until moonlight spilled across her open journal. Her hands shook as she lifted the pen. Beneath the cruel sentence she wrote another, one she hadn't dared to say aloud. But now I love him, and I don't know how to tell him without breaking both of us. When morning came, the first light fell across those words like forgiveness, and for the first time in her life, Etta realized she was afraid. Not of fire, not of loneliness, but of losing the one man she had finally learned to love. The days that followed passed like dust gathering on a roof, thin at first, quiet, but growing heavier with time. The house remained peaceful as ever, yet that peace had turned suffocating. Cole still rose before dawn, brewed coffee, worked the fields, and came home after sunset. He still walked past her in the kitchen, nodded once, lined his boots neatly by the door, but his eyes no longer lingered long enough to say he saw her. Dinner became a hollow ritual. She set the food down. He ate without a word. The sound of the knife scraping the plate filled the room, sharp enough that she had to stop herself from covering her ears. She tried small talk. "Did you meet anyone out by the ridge? Is the mare healing well?" But each question met only with a nod, brief and final. On the table, a candle burned low, its light trembling against his face. The sharp bones, the gray eyes dulled by thought, the quiet of a man carrying hurt too deep to voice. The shadows deepened around his mouth, and the silence between them grew into something almost physical, a wall neither dared to cross. Etta looked at his clenched hands and knew this wasn't anger. It was pain, the kind that time alone might mend, if time were kind enough to turn back. That night, he stepped out to the porch while she sat in the kitchen, holding a cold cup between restless fingers. She listened to the wind slip through the cracks of the door, to the steady rhythm of his boots pacing the boards outside. The chair across from her, the one he used to sit in, scribbling in his leather notebook, now felt empty, wooden, lifeless. She rose, each step heavier than the one before, the journal clutched in her hand. The same book that had once saved her from breaking, now the wound itself. Opening it, her eyes found the familiar line, dark and merciless on the page. "I married him to survive, not to love." Etta stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry. Tears would have been too simple. Instead, she took up her pen, her hand trembling but steady in resolve, and beneath it she wrote, "But now I see him, and it hurts to think he might stop waiting for me." The ink bled slowly, like a wound being opened just enough to clean. No apology could reach him now. But maybe, if he read this, he would know she was no longer the woman who came here just to survive. She closed the journal and ran her hand over the worn leather cover. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing against the window like a sigh. The next morning, she woke before the first light. The valley was still wrapped in shadow. She set the journal on the kitchen table, the place where he always sat to drink his morning coffee. She left it open to the page she'd written. No note, no words, no plea, just truth. For a long while she stood there, taking in the room. Everything was as it had been. The chair by the stove, the wool blanket drying on the porch rail, the faint scent of last night's coffee. It was all theirs yet hollow, as though the house itself had lost its pulse when his gaze stopped reaching for hers. She didn't say sorry. She couldn't. Some wounds reject words. The only gift left to give was honesty. Etta stepped outside into the small garden, where the chrysanthemums had begun to bloom, fragile white petals trembling in the chill of early autumn. They bent in the wind but never broke, straining always toward the light. When she turned back toward the window, Cole was already inside, seated at the table. He hadn't touched his cup. The dawn light lay across his face, soft and solemn. She saw him open the journal, pause, then lower his head. Whether he read it or not, she couldn't tell. But his hand stayed on the cover for a long time before he closed it gently, as if listening not to her words, but to the sound of his own heart remembering what it once waited for. In that small house they still lived together, breathing the same air, wrapped in the same quiet. Yet between them, something had changed. There was no longer a wall, only an empty space, a tender, waiting silence where love was learning how to speak its name. That afternoon, the sky over Copper Bend hung low and heavy. The wind came from the south, dry and biting, carrying a strange scent, smoke. Etta was kneading dough in the kitchen when she noticed the change in light. The sun, once golden, had turned to a deep, burning orange. Through the window, the horizon shimmered, and far beyond the low ridge, a column of black smoke rose, thick as breath from the devil's lungs. "Cole?" she called out, but only the wind answered. She ran to the porch. The far fields flickered with light. Fire. The wind howled, driving dust across the yard. Somewhere in the distance came the panicked cries of cattle, the wild scream of a horse. Then a flash, lightning without thunder, split the horizon. Cole burst from the barn, his voice hoarse. "Fire's coming fast!" He grabbed the last horse's reins, slapped its flank hard, sending it galloping toward the stream. Flames licked the edges of the fields now, curling upward like hands hungry for everything they could reach. The glow carved his face in two, half shadow, half steel. "Inside, Etta!" he shouted. But she didn't move. Through the haze of smoke, her eyes found the window, the small wooden table by it, where Cole kept his leather journal, the one he never let her touch. Once he'd said, in a voice distant and quiet, "Just words nobody needs to read." But she knew it wasn't just words. It was the part of him that still bled, the soft, secret heart behind the scar. Before she could think, she ran back inside. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking. Each breath seared her throat. She crouched low, dragging her skirt over her mouth, pushing toward the parlor. The air shimmered with heat. The curtains caught fire, the flames crawling along the walls like a living thing. There, on the table, the journal lay where he'd left it. She lunged forward, grabbed it, and felt her palms burn. The leather hissed against her skin, but she clutched it to her chest anyway. Above her, a timber cracked, splitting with a groan. "Etta!" Cole's voice tore through the roar of fire. She turned just as his figure burst through the smoke. He threw his arms around her, pulling her hard toward the door. The ceiling gave way behind them. Sparks rained down like stars gone mad. The two of them stumbled out into the open air, tumbling into the dirt as the porch collapsed behind them. For a moment, the world was nothing but the hiss of flame and the taste of ash. Cole's body covered hers, his breath ragged against her ear. His arm, raw and blistering, still held her tight. "Cole," she whispered. He lifted his head, eyes red from smoke, voice cracked and tender. "You're out of your damn mind, Etta May. You should have—" She pressed her hand against his mouth, shaking her head. "I couldn't let it burn," she breathed. "That book, it's you." He stared at her, confusion and disbelief flickering across his soot-streaked face. Then, faintly, he smiled, tired, trembling, but real. "It's just paper." She shook her head, tears cutting through the ash on her cheeks. "No, it's you. It's every word you never said." The wind swept through the clearing, scattering embers into the sky. They sat amid the charred earth, the journal clutched against her chest. Behind them, the house roared as the roof gave way, flames blooming upward in a final gasp. But in front of her, all she could see was him. His eyes, gray and alive, his hand, burned but steady, resting against her shoulder. Etta leaned into him, her voice soft and cracked. "I stayed," she whispered, "because you're the only place I ever felt safe." Cole said nothing. The wind gentled, pulling the smoke apart. His hand moved through her ash-covered hair, trembling. Neither of them cried. They didn't have to. Both knew that everything old had turned to dust, and what remained could never burn. They stayed there until the stars came out, backs against each other, the journal between their hands. Its cover was blackened, edges curled, but the pages within had survived. When dawn finally came, the first light touched the smoke that lingered over the valley, turning it the color of rose gold. Etta lifted her face toward it and understood. Sometimes it takes fire to burn away what's gone and to make room for what's finally, fiercely alive. Morning crept in slowly after the fire. Copper Bend lay under a veil of gray. Sky, earth, their hair, even their eyes, all the same pale shade of ash. Nothing moved except the wind. The last columns of smoke twisted upward, then dissolved into the faint dawn. Etta and Cole sat side by side on the remains of the porch. The boards beneath them were charred black, still whispering smoke that carried the bitter scent of burnt wood. Before them lay what used to be their home, a heap of ashes and memory. Far out in the field, a few horses moved ghost-like through the mist. Overhead, clouds rolled white as washed linen. Between them, resting in both their hands, lay the leather journal. Its cover was scorched and curled at the edges, but the pages within had survived, as though the fire itself had paused, granting mercy to one small thing. Cole brushed his fingertips over the darkened cover. His voice came rough but gentle. "You knew about this book?" Etta didn't answer right away. She looked at his hands. Cracked, blistered, raw in places where the skin had burned. Then she nodded slowly. "I knew," she said softly, "because it was you, and I needed to save what was left." Cole studied her for a long time. The early light caught the ash in her hair, turning it silver. Her dress was streaked with soot, her face smudged but steady. She held the book as though it carried the soul of everything they'd endured. He started to speak, then stopped, exhaling instead. The wind stirred, lifting a handful of ash into the air. It spun around them like dusted snow. Light, harmless now, no longer fire but memory. "Weren't you afraid?" he asked, voice low. "When you saw the flames?" Etta turned toward the cottonwood tree, now stripped bare, its branches blackened. "I was," she said, But I was more afraid of something else. What? That you'd walk away, and I'd have nothing left worth saving. The words fell softly, but they landed deep. Cole's shoulders tightened, his head bowing slightly, as though the air itself had grown heavier. He looked down at his hands, rough palms, blistered skin, dried blood in the creases. Etta reached for them without hesitation. She didn't ask. Her small, trembling fingers folded around his, their skin meeting, smoke, warmth, pain, and life. It wasn't comfort she offered. It was proof. Proof that they were still here, still breathing. Cole didn't pull away. He closed his eyes. "You shouldn't have risked it for me," he murmured, voice breaking. "I'm not worth that." "I know," she said quietly. "But sometimes, what's worth keeping isn't perfect. It's just real." They sat together in silence. The wind sighed through the broken frame of the porch, scattering the ashes with a sound like dry rain. Between them, the journal lay open to its first page. The faint writing, still visible through the soot, read, "For the things I couldn't say." Etta lifted her free hand and touched the back of his. His skin was rough, warm under her fingertips. Then, gently, she bent and pressed her lips to the burned patch near his wrist. Not to heal it, but to say what words could not. "I'm sorry. I love you. We're still here." When she looked up, his eyes were open. He didn't speak. He just looked at her. Gaze bright through the haze, soft and disbelieving, full of forgiveness and something stronger. His fingers tightened around hers. This time, it was him who held on first. The quiet between them felt sacred. Everything that needed to be said lived in their joined hands, in the thin smoke curling upward, in the weight of what they'd survived. Above them, the sun climbed higher, its light washing gold over the ruins. It touched the journal, the burned boards, their clasped hands. Etta's voice came as a whisper. Maybe the fire didn't take anything that mattered. Cole looked up, his lips curving faintly. "No," he said. "It just showed us what was worth saving." The wind carried the last of the ash into the open sky. The smoke faded to nothing, and there, on the scorched porch of what once was, two people sat in the warmth of a morning that felt new, their hands still joined, their fear finally gone. Spring returned to Copper Bend, with the scent of young grass and the song of thawing streams. The fire from the year before had faded into memory, but its ashes had fed new life. Behind the house, where the garden once stood a willow that had burned down to nothing. Now, from its blackened stump, slender green shoots reached upward, trembling leaves learning again how to hold the light. Etta often came there in the mornings. She would stand still for long moments, tracing her fingers along the rough bark. There was something about that willow that mirrored her own soul, once broken, once burned, once certain nothing could ever grow again. Yet here it was, living. That morning, the sky was pale, filled with drifting clouds. Cole had asked her to come outside, his voice lower, slower than usual. She stepped out and found him standing beneath the willow, something small glinting in his hand, a warm gleam of polished wood beneath the soft light. When he turned, his smile was brief but full. "It's from the tree," he said quietly, "the part that didn't burn." Etta came closer. Resting in his palm was a ring. No stone, no carving, just a smooth circle of willow wood, worn to a soft shine. The grain swirled like water, darker lines curling through it in quiet beauty. Simple, bare. But when the sun caught it, it seemed to glow from within, like something that remembered both fire and forgiveness. Her breath caught. "Cole, you?" He nodded. "Made it myself. The old tools in the shed still worked." His gaze lifted to hers, suddenly steady, the faintest tremor in his hands. "It's not much, but—" He stopped, drew a long breath, and then sank to one knee. The earth beneath him was dark and soft, the roots of the willow brushing his shoulder as the wind stirred its leaves. His voice came rough but certain. "If that tree can grow again," he said, "maybe we can too." The wind answered first, swaying the branches so they whispered above them. Etta looked at him. This man who had walked out of darkness, once branded a killer, once so quiet he'd sat outside her door all night just to make sure she wasn't afraid. And now here he was, kneeling before her on the same ground the fire had tried to erase. She smiled through her tears, her hand trembling as it rose to touch his hair. Ash still clung to a few strands, remnants of what they had survived. Everything she'd once feared had become what she was most grateful for. Her voice came soft, halting, but sure. "I used to pray for a place to belong. Turns out, it was never a place. It was you." Cole lifted his eyes, and the morning light caught them like water over stone. He said nothing, only slipped the ring gently onto her finger. The wood was cool at first, then warmed quickly to her skin. He looked down at that hand, the same hand that once trembled in fear, that now held his with quiet strength. They said nothing more. The whisper of the willow above them was enough. After a while, she helped him to his feet. Together they looked up at the young branches swaying in the wind, their reflections falling soft and green over the blackened ground. "We'll build it again," Cole murmured. "Right here." Etta smiled. "We already have." He laughed then, a real laugh, rare and tender, breaking through the silence like sunlight after long rain. She leaned into his shoulder, turning the wooden ring lightly with her thumb. The grain shimmered in the light, fine as golden thread. And in that moment, Etta understood that love never needed grand gestures. It only asked for two steady hands, one heart willing to stay, and a willow that knew how to rise from ash. Beyond them, the fields spread green once more. The stream wound through the rocks, catching pieces of sky. And there, on the land reborn from fire, two people sat beneath the living willow, listening to the quiet rhythm of wind and hearts that had finally learned to beat as one. Evening fell slowly over Copper Bend, spilling golden light across the valley like honey. After a long winter, the ground had softened, and tender shoots of grass grew around the willow that had survived the fire. Its branches swayed gently, scattering flecks of sunlight on the earth below like pieces of rippling water. Etta stood beneath it, her dark cotton dress moving softly in the breeze. From the porch, Cole walked toward her, sleeves rolled up, a streak of sunlight cutting across his shoulder. Since the day he'd slipped the ring on her finger, they hadn't needed many words. Everything between them had settled, quiet, steady, whole. As if the two of them had walked through all the ash and finally met on the other side of silence. She bent and slipped off her shoes. The soil beneath her feet was cool, tender, forgiving, like memory made soft again. When she looked up, he had stopped a few steps away, watching her with that shy, uncertain smile that always came when peace felt too good to be real. "Come here," she said. He frowned lightly, but obeyed. "What for?" "Just this." She reached out her hand. Cole hesitated, looking at it. The same hand that had once trembled over a needle and thread, once carried a pen through the dark, once stitched his torn skin with shaking fingers. Then he lifted his own and touched her palm. That first contact of the evening was simple, but it stole their breath. No music, no audience, only the whisper of leaves, the hush of the willow like a stream far off. She took one step, and he followed. Their movements were clumsy at first, unsure, but soon their rhythm found each other's, the soft sway of breath, the slow circling of feet on grass. Her hand rested on his shoulder. His found the small of her back, where her heartbeat pulsed faintly beneath the thin fabric. "Feels strange," he murmured, a faint smile in his voice. "Never danced before." "Then don't think," she whispered. "Just listen." "To what?" "Everything." And they did. Their bodies moved in a rhythm made only of wind and heartbeat. The grass bent beneath them, the willow's branches brushed their hair, and every quiet turn drew them closer. When Etta looked up, she saw the whole sky reflected in his eyes, wide, calm, and free of fear. For years she had run from fire, from memory, from herself. But now, within his arms, she realized she'd stopped somewhere along the way, and he had been waiting there all along. "Cole," she said softly, "maybe love doesn't arrive with thunder." He leaned closer until their foreheads met. "No? Maybe it just waits until we stop running." Her words melted into the wind. Cole smiled, a faint curve that reached his eyes, and drew her in tighter. They stood like that under the willow's shade as the sun touched the hilltops, light falling in ribbons across her hair. Then a sudden gust swept through, and the willow's leaves rained down like green confetti. Etta laughed, clear, startled, full of life. He watched her, eyes tender in a way that seemed to hold the entire world in that single moment. They moved again, slowly, almost weightless. Their steps matched without thought now, each one softer than the last, until their shadows merged into one long shape stretching with the sunset. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat beneath his shirt, the only sound left in a world that had once been full of fire and storm. "Maybe this is it," she whispered. "The end of running." He didn't answer, only nodded, his chin brushing her hair. The light faded, and the first crickets began to sing. Beneath the reborn willow, they turned slowly in the dusk, hands still joined, as if time itself had grown tired and paused to watch. The sky deepened, from gold to violet, then to the hush of night. Their shadows lay across the grass, one shape now, still and sure, like two wanderers who had crossed the desert, walked through ash, and at last found water. No music, no vows, only love, quiet, enduring, and enough. The story of Etta and Cole ends in the soft twilight of the West, where scars fade, fears rest, and even the ashes learn to bloom. No grand promises, no orchestra, just two souls who once lost themselves and found each other again in the stillness of faith. At any age, we all long for the same thing, a place to come home to, a hand that stays, no matter the fire or the wind. Perhaps love, in the end, isn't loud at all. It's the courage to stay, to forgive, and to believe we are still worthy of being loved. If this story made your heart pause for a moment, if you've ever believed that real love doesn't need words, only presence, leave a comment below and tell us what it stirred in you. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more Wild West love stories, where every sunset holds a promise and every heart learns to begin again.